read a little bit from the book of Romans to you, Romans chapter 1, and starting in verse 16. The Apostle Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." All right, so what do we need to understand about the gospel? What do we need to understand about salvation? Those are like the big questions that I think we often assume are the most important questions of life, Christianity, certainly. What is the gospel? Well, the gospel is good news. What is salvation? We tend to think of it, I think, as modern Christians, evangelicals especially, think about it this way. Like we think that the salvation Paul's talking about is like going to heaven when we die. I want to argue that that's not really in Paul's mind, and not really in most of the New Testament writers' minds when they think about salvation. It's not this going to be in this ethereal, out-of-body experience with Jesus, with God, in the streets of gold or whatever for all eternity, but rather, I think the view that Paul and the New Testament as a whole presents us with, and Jesus in the Gospels present us with, is this idea of heaven as this thing that comes from the sphere of God. Heaven is the realm of God, but it's coming to invade earth. And that's the salvation that's being talked about here. It's this redemption, it's this renewal, it's this restoration of things, of the world, of this broken world, back to God. All right, so I think we need to understand, if we want to understand Romans 1, 16 through 17, we need to understand what Paul means about the righteousness of God, because that's what he says is revealed in the gospel. He says, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And I think that has, what Paul's saying there is not just that the gospel, that just the righteousness of God is clear, or that it's been made known, that we can now understand it and see it. It's bigger than that. This idea of made manifest or revealed is this idea that like the gospel is taking root. It's the righteousness of God has infiltrated our world. It has taken root, and it's having an effect on this world that's going to radically transform it and change it. I think that's what's going on here. And so even though after this, Paul's going to give us a really bleak view of humanity, he's going to talk about how broken, how spiritually broken and sinful humanity is. Even though Paul seems in some way to have a bleak description of humanity, we're going to see, and God's posture towards them, ultimately it's good news that God is revealing his righteousness in this world. I want you to know that. And how is this revelation, this taking root of righteousness, good news? How is it good news about God's power to save people and salvation? And how's it good news about salvation? Well, as I said, salvation in Paul's mind isn't about being rescued from this world so that you can go to heaven when you die. It's that God will rescue and redeem you in this world, and that's an important distinction. God will rescue the entirety of creation from corruption and decay, and he promises us new bodies and a new heavens and a new earth. The Bible's vision about salvation, this is really important to grasp, is not about escape, but about engagement. It's about redemption, renewal, resurrection, restoration. The gospel is good news about God's plan to save this world, and that saving happens by God revealing his righteousness, his justice, him making his justice known, but not just known, making it felt and experienced. God's vision for you and for me is for us to experience his righteousness. And that's good news, because right now we don't, in a lot of ways. Some ways we do, maybe, but in a lot of ways we don't. Like, right now we're experiencing loss. Right now we're experiencing, in America, we're experiencing inflation. Right now we're experiencing the tightening of our belt that comes with inflation, right? And we're experiencing frustration with all kinds of things, with the state of politics, with our relationships with our friends, with our relationship with our spouses, with our work. Our work isn't as fulfilling as we'd like it to be, and it's not giving us what we want it to give us. So here's what I want to say to you. The gospel is good news about God's plan to save And this saving happens by a revelation of justice, a feeling of justice, a sense of justice taking hold, taking root, and beginning to impact our world. This is why Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because he wants us to pray, to look to God, to bring his will to bear in our world. Right now, God's will is not done in many ways, certainly not in our hearts and in our lives oftentimes. But we want, what it means to follow Jesus in a sense is to desire, to long for his goodness and justice to infiltrate more and more of our world and our lives. And it isn't merely future, right? The salvation that's talked about here. It's the power of God's love breaking into the present and freeing people from the power of sin and death and establishing God's righteousness on earth. But there's a problem, right? We'll get to it next week. But the problem is human brokenness, human sinfulness. Our world doesn't always feel like a place where God's justice has been established, does it? And I don't want to be glib, but I think there's an answer to that question. Why do we not always feel God's justice? How do we know that God's just even though we don't always feel his justice? Well, I think the ultimate answer, and this is a real Sunday school answer, right? But the ultimate answer is Jesus. Jesus is how God's promise to Abraham to redeem the world is fulfilled. Jesus and all that he is and all that he embodies and all that he does is God's justice being revealed and established on earth. You ever have a feeling like God's not fair and just? Look to Jesus and how he embodies justice. That's a picture of our future to come. I think we have a future to come. A future to come as it follows Jesus. We have a future that's to come that where everyone is much more like Jesus. In other words, everyone's gentle, kind, loving, persevering, sincere, truthful. Can you imagine living in a world like that where people were more like Jesus? How beautiful of a world would that be? Jesus reminds us that that's our promised future, and that gives me hope. I hope it does for you too. We'll see you again next week.